The lamps in Baker Street flickered against the panes as the mist thickened over London, dimming even the glow of the street lanterns. I sat opposite Holmes, who was bent over his chemical apparatus, scrutinizing a solution of such intensity that one would imagine the fate of nations depended upon its precise color. For my part, I had abandoned the evening paper, its columns filled with accounts of political wranglings and a curious scandal in society, and allowed my mind to wander toward more ordinary concerns. The quiet, broken only by the bubbling of Holmes's retorts and the occasional crackle of the fire, had that curious quality of suspension, as though time itself had paused to allow us breath between adventures. It was therefore all the more striking when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a lady of such evident distress that even Holmes looked up from his bench. She was young, perhaps 25, with a pale, drawn face and eyes which seemed to have been robbed of rest for many nights. Her cloak was heavy with rain, and she clutched at its folds as though seeking protection from more than the weather. "Mr. Holmes," she began in a trembling voice, her gaze flitting between us, "you must forgive this intrusion. I had no one else to whom I might appeal." Holmes had already risen and offered her the armchair nearest the fire. His manner, though brisk, carried with it that peculiar courtesy he reserved for those in evident distress. "You are most welcome here, madam. Pray compose yourself. I perceive that you have traveled with some haste. Watson, the brandy, if you please." I fetched the decanter, and after she had taken a sip, her trembling seemed to abate somewhat. Holmes regarded her with that hawk-like intensity which never failed to unnerve a stranger, though to me it had long become familiar. "You come to me upon a matter of urgency," he said softly. "That much is clear. You have not eaten this day, nor did you pause to change your garments despite the rain. Your gloves are missing. You have either dropped them in your agitation or left them behind in your carriage. Am I correct?" Her lips parted in astonishment, and she nodded faintly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I came as quickly as I could. I am Lady Eveline Montague. It is my cousin, my dearest Clara, who has vanished. The police will not listen. They insist she has eloped, but I know she has not. She would never, never leave us so." At this, the poor lady's composure failed, and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Holmes allowed the silence to linger just long enough for her to recover, then seated himself opposite, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Pray relate the circumstances to us in as precise a manner as you can manage," said he. "Leave nothing out, however trivial it may appear." Lady Eveline drew a breath and began. "Last night Clara and I attended a ball at the home of Sir James Weatherby in Mayfair. We remained until nearly 1 o'clock. A carriage was ordered for Clara, while I remained behind with other friends. She was to go directly home to Montague House. Yet when the carriage arrived, the horses came alone, the reins dangling and frayed, and Clara was gone. The footman swears he saw her step into it, and yet she never reached her home." Holmes's eyes glittered. "The horses returned driverless, and the reins were cut. Was there no sign of struggle?" "None, Mr. Holmes. Only that Clara's shawl was missing, and a faint scent of lavender remained upon the cushions. The police maintain that she must have gone willingly, that she fled with some secret companion. They hint at disgrace." Her voice trembled again. "But Clara is no wanton creature. She is heir to my uncle's fortune, yes, but she is gentle, dutiful, and honorable. She would never shame us." "Your uncle?" Holmes asked quickly. "Lord Montague. He is in declining health, and Clara is his sole heir. He doted upon her as though she were his daughter. Since my own father's death, she and I have been as sisters. Oh, Mr. Holmes, if some villain has spirited her away—" "Rest assured, Lady Eveline, we shall spare no effort," Holmes interjected with calm assurance. "Watson, you observe? The carriage returned, but the horses bore marks of haste. The reins cut deliberately, not broken. That alone is sufficient to dispel the notion of elopement. Pray tell me, was Clara seen speaking with anyone unusual at the ball?" Lady Eveline hesitated. Yes, there was a gentleman. He was tall, of foreign appearance, with piercing eyes. He approached Clara twice during the evening, once in the gallery and again as the dancing concluded. She seemed disturbed by his attentions. I cannot say whether she knew him." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you catch his name?" "I did not. Others remarked upon his manner of speech. It was marked, perhaps Eastern European. But when I inquired later, no one knew him." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Watson, I dare say we shall trace this phantom suitor before long." Lady Eveline, one more question. When the carriage returned, who was first to inspect it? My uncle's steward, Mr. Graves. He raised the alarm at once. Since then, the house has been in turmoil. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze unfocused as though he already pieced together fragments of an unseen puzzle. At last he rose and extended his hand. Lady Eveline, you have done wisely to come here. Return now to Montague House and reassure your uncle that all is not lost. Dr. Watson and I shall visit the carriage yard at once. There is much to be learned from the smallest of traces. She thanked him fervently, though still pale and anxious, and departed under Mrs. Hudson's care. No sooner had the door closed than Holmes seized his hat and coat. Come, Watson, said he, with that sudden animation which ever heralded action. We go to the carriage yard. The truth, I suspect, lies not in Mayfair's ballrooms, but in the mud upon a carriage wheel. The rain had slackened into a fine drizzle as we hailed a cab and rattled through the streets toward the stables of Montague House. The gas lamps cast a dim glow upon the glistening cobbles, and the air was sharp with the smell of damp horseflesh and wet leather when we arrived. Holmes wasted no words but went directly to the carriage, a handsome equipage now splashed and muddied from its strange errand. With his lantern, he crouched examining the wheels and steps, running his long fingers along the cushions and the cut reins. His movements were rapid, precise, yet with the air of one who sees a world invisible to the rest of us. Watson, he murmured, observe here, the fray upon this rein. Not the rough severance of accident, but a clean slice from a sharp blade. And here on the wheel, a trace of clay not from London streets. This is Thames-side mud, if I am not mistaken. And smell, my dear fellow, do you detect it? I bent close and caught a faint chemical odor, sharp and unfamiliar. Precisely, Holmes said with satisfaction. Not lavender, as our fair client supposed, but a tincture used in certain foreign preparations. Allure, Watson, allure for the senses. I fancy our mysterious suitor is no stranger to the laboratory. His eyes shone as he straightened, the lantern's light casting deep shadows across his features. The game is afoot once more, Watson. We stand at the threshold of a design most intricate, and unless I am much mistaken, this city shall yet hear the name of Clara Montague in tones of scandal or triumph. Come, we have work to do, and swiftly. And thus, from the quiet of a rainy evening in Baker Street, we were drawn into a mystery whose threads would lead us from Mayfair's glittering halls to the shadowed depths of London's river docks, where the fate of a missing heiress hung in the balance. The lantern in Holmes's hand threw a wavering glow across the damp yard, its light glistening upon puddles and iron-bound wheels. The horses stamped uneasily in their stalls as though sensing the late disturbance, and the air smelled of wet hay and leather. Holmes's keen eyes moved ceaselessly, scanning not only the carriage but the ground itself, where the night's rain had softened the earth into a dark, impressionable canvas. I had long since abandoned the hope of keeping pace with his mind, contenting myself instead with careful observation of his actions, for it was in these swift, silent movements that the true shape of the case began to emerge. He crouched beside the wheel once more, his fingers tracing the ridges in the mud. Watson, he murmured, what do you see here? I bent closer, though to me the tracks were an indistinct mess of hoof prints and ruts. The wheel marks are deep, as though the horses had bolted in haste. Beyond that, I confess I see little. Holmes smiled faintly. Your honesty, Watson, is always refreshing. Yet look again. Here the wheel sinks abruptly deeper, and there the impression is lighter. What does it tell you? That the carriage swerved? Exactly. And not by chance. Observe the width between the impressions. The carriage was forced sharply aside, perhaps by a figure leaping to the step. Note, too, this lighter mark. The weight was lessened, for a passenger had been removed. It was here, I think, that Clara Montague ceased to be in that conveyance. A chill ran through me at his words. Then she was taken, dragged out in the street? Holmes shook his head. Not in the street, Watson. No commotion, no cry was reported. London is never so silent as to allow an abduction in Mayfair to pass unmarked. No, this was done in a more secluded spot. The horses were then loosed, sent galloping homeward, to present the illusion of accident. It is artifice, Watson, and clever artifice at that. We moved toward the rear of the carriage, where Holmes's lantern revealed a faint smear upon the varnished panel. He touched it lightly and held his fingers to the light. A scuff of paint, no, tar perhaps, and here on the step a broken thread of lace. I dare say this is from the missing shawl Lady Eveline mentioned. She struggled, however briefly. My indignation flared. Holmes, this is abduction in its foulest form. A lady of breeding carried off in the night and the police would dismiss it as elopement? Holmes's eyes narrowed. You touch upon the heart of it, Watson. When, scandal is easier to believe than crime. The criminal walks at leisure, yet I tell you there is more than mere abduction here. Greed lies at the root, I'll wager, and greed allied with patience. The heiress is no common victim. At that moment, a lantern approached, bobbing through the mist. It was the steward, Mr. Graves, a stout man with ruddy cheeks whose cautious step suggested reluctance to intrude. Begging your pardon, gentlemen, he said, but I thought you might require assistance. His lordship is beside himself, and Lady Eveline near faint with worry. Can I be of service? Holmes regarded him coolly. We require facts, Mr. Graves. Who first discovered the carriage? I did, sir. The horses clattered into the yard near 2 o'clock, wild-eyed and foaming. I ran at once to the door, found the coachman gone, and Mistress Clara absent. I roused the household immediately. You did not pursue the animal's trail? Not in the dark, sir. The rain was heavy. We thought it best to summon the constable. Holmes's gaze lingered upon the man with that searching intensity which had shaken so many in my presence. Graves shifted uneasily, his hand fumbling with the lantern handle. That will be all, Holmes said at length. Return to your duties, but remain within call. The steward bobbed his head and retreated. Holmes watched until he vanished into the mist, then said softly, There is a nervousness in that man, Watson, which is not wholly due to grief. He has either concealed something or fears discovery. We shall keep him in mind. We spent another half-hour in examination, during which Holmes gathered several tiny scraps into an envelope, a shred of dark cloth snagged upon the carriage step, the fragment of lace and a trace of the tar-like substance. At last, satisfied, he closed the lantern and we returned to Baker Street. Once there, Holmes wasted no time. By the firelight, he spread his trophies upon the table, examining each with a magnifying glass. The cloth fragment, he declared, was a foreign make, cheap but sturdy, used in garments fashioned upon the continent. The tar-like smear, when treated with reagents from his shelf, yielded a peculiar chemical tang that set his eyes alight. Watson, we are dealing with no ordinary villain. This substance is from the docks, specifically the tar used to seal crates bound for long voyages. The mud upon the wheels likewise bore traces of river clay. Mark me. Clara Montague was not spirited into some back alley for ransom. She is destined for the Thames. I stared at him, aghast. The Thames? You do not mean... Alive, Watson, alive. Else why such elaborate contrivance? To kill in haste requires no carriage and no lantern. No, she is to be transported, smuggled out perhaps beyond English law. The heiress of Montague will not be ransomed. She will be married abroad, against her will, to some scoundrel whose fortune is naught but ambition, and once bound, her inheritance is bound with her. The clarity of his vision struck me with both admiration and horror. But who, Holmes? Who has such boldness? Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. We have one lead, the mysterious gentleman of foreign aspect, tall, sharp-eyed, with a marked accent. Lady Eveline described him precisely enough for me to place him. Anton Varga, Watson, a name whispered in continental circles, a fortune hunter of the worst sort. He has prowled Vienna, Paris, and Rome, leaving behind whispers of ruined women and emptied purses. That he should attempt his game upon English soil is bold indeed, but boldness is the cloak of desperation. He has failed abroad. Here lies his last chance. And you are certain it is he? As certain as I may be without sight of his face. The initials upon this glove, AV, match him exactly. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when coincidence aligns with motive, Watson, it ceases to be mere chance. Tomorrow we shall confirm his presence in London. Tonight, we prepare. I confess sleep eluded me. The vision of Clara Montague, drugged or bound, borne toward some foreign shore, haunted my mind. Yet when morning came, Holmes was his usual brisk self, having apparently rested well. He dispatched telegrams with his customary precision. One, to a contact at Scotland Yard. Another to an informant upon the docks. By noon he had confirmation. Varga lodges at the Belvedere Hotel in Mayfair, he told me, though under an assumed name. He has kept company with no respectable family, but has been seen frequently near the river. We go at once, Watson. His time grows short, and ours with it. Thus it was that scarcely a day after Lady Eveline's appeal we found ourselves walking beneath the colonnade of the Belvedere, the drizzle clinging to our coats, the gas lamps gleaming dully against the wet stone. Holmes's eyes were bright with that peculiar fire which signaled the hunt was at its keenest point. I knew then that Clara Montague's fate, grim though it yet appeared, would be contested to the last breath by Sherlock Holmes. The Belvedere Hotel stood with the quiet dignity of an old aristocrat, its stone facade glistening faintly in the drizzle. Cabs clattered upon the street before it. Umbrellas moved like dark blossoms opening and shutting as passers-by hurried along, and from within drifted the faint murmur of violins and muted laughter. It was one of those establishments where discretion was purchased as easily as fine port, and the presence of foreigners of fortune or title caused no stir. Holmes and I entered through the revolving door, our damp coats drawing no notice from the liveried porter. The air inside was warm, redolent of polished mahogany and cigar smoke, and a great fire blazed in the marble hearth. Holmes's eyes, sharp as ever, roved over the scene with the economy of a hawk. His pace was leisurely, almost languid, but I knew the rapidity of his deductions outstripped any outward sign. "There," he murmured, inclining his head slightly toward a group seated near the window. "Observe the tall figure with the angular features, sipping brandy with excessive delicacy. His companion plays the part of servant, though the cut of his coat betrays a man of some standing. That is our Anton Varga." The man in question was striking indeed, thin yet broad-shouldered, his black hair brushed immaculately, and his gaze darting ceaselessly across the room as though every face might conceal an enemy. Even in repose there was something restless, something predatory about him. His long fingers caressed the stem of the glass, yet the muscles of his jaw were tense. Holmes adjusted his cuff and strolled casually to a vacant table nearby. I followed, my nerves taut with suppressed excitement. We ordered coffee, and Holmes, pretending to stir sugar into his cup, angled the spoon so that its polished surface reflected Varga's table. "A creature of habit, Watson," he said softly. "Notice how he sits with his back to the wall, never exposing himself to the doors. His right hand never strays far from his coat, likely a weapon there. And his companion? A secretary, perhaps, or a co-conspirator. See how he whispers discreetly, passing papers beneath the napkin. Then you are convinced this is the man responsible for Clara Montague's disappearance? Convinced? Not yet. But the web is tightening. Mark my words, the docks will furnish our answer. That fellow reeks of the river trade. Even here you see the faint smear of tar upon his cuff. He was upon the wharf not long ago." I followed his gaze, and indeed, though faint, a black streak marred the otherwise impeccable white of Varga's cuff. For some minutes we observed in silence. Then Varga rose, signaling to his companion. They moved swiftly toward the staircase, disappearing from view. Holmes drained his coffee at a gulp. "Come, Watson. We must see where he goes, but subtly. Let us not spook the quarry." We ascended the stairs at a distance, careful to pause when the creak of floorboards ahead betrayed Varga's progress. At the second landing, Holmes held me back and we listened. A door clicked shut, followed by the faint scrape of a key in the lock. Holmes crouched, examining the carpet. "Room 214, he whispered. "Note the faint indentation from his boots and the smell. Watson, do you perceive it?" I sniffed, uncertain. "Perhaps cigar smoke?" Holmes shook his head. "Laudanum. The faint tincture of opiate. It clings to his garments. That suggests our heiress is indeed here, or at least that she was transported under its influence. We must know what lies beyond that door." Before I could protest, he moved down the corridor and spoke in a low voice to a passing maid. His manner, courteous yet authoritative, soon had the girl whispering back. She pointed toward the end of the hall, her eyes wide with both awe and fear. Holmes slipped a coin into her palm and she vanished quickly. "He keeps the room under another name," Holmes informed me. "Van der Kroon of Rotterdam." The staff believe him a Dutch merchant, eccentric but wealthy. He has ordered trunks delivered directly to the river wharf tomorrow night. My heart leapt. Then Clara must be hidden in those trunks. Not so fast, Watson. A human body cannot be smuggled so crudely without suspicion. No, the trunks will contain garments, perhaps papers, supplies for a swift departure. Clara Montague will be moved separately under closer guard, yet the trunks tell us where. Tomorrow night the wharf is his chosen ground. We must be there before him. The corridor creaked. Holmes pulled me into a shadowed alcove just as Varga's servant emerged, closing the door softly behind him. He carried a bundle under his arm and descended the stair. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Shall we follow him, Holmes?" I whispered. "Indeed, Watson. The servant is the weaker link. Follow him, and we may unravel his master's schemes." We descended in pursuit, keeping a careful distance. The servant left the hotel and strode briskly through the wet streets, his bundle concealed beneath his cloak. The lamps cast long reflections upon the rain-slick pavement, and the air smelled of coal smoke and river fog. We followed through twisting alleys until he entered a small apothecary's shop, its shutters half drawn. Holmes pressed himself against the brick wall, signaling me to silence. From within came muffled voices, the clink of glass. A few minutes later, the servant emerged again, lighter of burden. Holmes's gaze darted to the shop window where faint letters spelled Meldrum and Codernd Chemists. "Laudanum, Watson," Holmes murmured. "A further supply. They mean to keep her subdued until the voyage is accomplished. That confirms it." We followed again, this time only until the servant reached a small boarding house and disappeared inside. Holmes stopped. To press further tonight would risk discovery. We know enough, the trunks, the laudanum, the wharf. Tomorrow we shall act. Scotland Yard will furnish men, though Lestrade may grumble. Tonight, Watson, we must prepare. Thus it was that we returned to Baker Street, where Holmes busied himself with maps of the riverside warehouses, marking each wharf where foreign ships were moored. His eyes glittered as he pieced together the puzzle, each scrap of evidence fitting into place. "Varga will not leave London unchallenged," he said with quiet conviction. "But mark this, Watson, he is dangerous. Tomorrow night may bring confrontation such as we have seldom faced. Steel yourself, for it will not be mere deduction but action, upon which Miss Montague's life depends." His words weighed heavily upon me. As I gazed into the firelight, imagining the terrified face of Clara Montague imprisoned in some drugged stupor, I resolved that whatever perils awaited us upon the river, I would stand by Holmes's side to the end. The rain beat harder against the windows, and the fog pressed thickly against the panes, as though the city itself sought to stifle the light within. Somewhere in that darkness, Clara Montague's fate hung suspended by the slimmest of threads, and only the genius of Sherlock Holmes could cut her free. The fog was heavy the following morning, so dense that even the stout chimneys of Baker Street stood half-veiled as though the whole city were wrapped in gauze. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the murk, pacing before the fire with his dressing gown flaring behind him, his pipe clenched firmly between his teeth. The floor about him was strewn with maps of the riverfront, scraps of timetables, and penciled notes that only he could interpret. "Watson," he said abruptly, "you will accompany me to Scotland Yard within the hour. We must rouse Lestrade from his bureaucratic slumber. If my calculations are correct, and I flatter myself they usually are, Varga's departure will occur not later than tonight, and by a specific steamer moored at Wapping." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, for Holmes had kept me awake until near dawn in discussion of tides, shipping manifests, and the peculiar chemistry of laudanum. "And you are certain it is Wapping?" I asked. "As certain as I can be without catching the villain red-handed. Consider, Watson. His trunks are consigned to a company whose warehouse lies but 2 streets from the wharf. The ship Zephyr, bound for Antwerp, sails on the midnight tide. Varga's financial interests point toward the continent. It is all too neat, too precise." He thrust a slip of paper into my hand, an address scrawled in his rapid script. "We shall meet Lestrade here. Persuading him will not be easy, but I trust your presence will lend weight. Scotland Yard loves its physicians, particularly those who once served the Empire. Now fetch your coat. There is no time to lose." The cab ride through the fog-choked streets was dreary, the lamps appearing and vanishing like pale phantoms. London seemed hushed as though holding its breath. Holmes remained silent, his eyes half closed, his mind evidently racing far ahead. I knew better than to interrupt him at such times, for when he brooded thus, the smallest word could be an intrusion. At Scotland Yard, we found Lestrade already at his desk, grumbling over reports. He eyed Holmes with mingled irritation and respect, for though Holmes had often embarrassed the Yard with his superior deductions, even Lestrade could not deny the value of his results. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said in his clipped manner, "another of your fanciful theories, I presume. What is it this time? A missing cat or a conspiracy against the Crown?" Holmes ignored the barb. "A conspiracy against the Montague fortune, Inspector, and a young woman's liberty at stake. I have reason to believe Clara Montague, missing heiress, is even now a prisoner in the hands of Anton Varga, an adventurer of international notoriety. Tonight he intends to spirit her out of the country aboard the Zephyr, sailing from Wapping." Lestrade raised his brows. "Do you now? And what proof have you, beyond your imagination?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glittering. "Proof sufficient to satisfy any rational mind. Witnesses at the Belvedere Hotel identify him. His servant purchased laudanum at an apothecary late last night. Trunks consigned to him are already marked for Antwerp. If you wait until morning, Inspector, you will be left with nothing but regrets." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, drumming his fingers upon the desk. He glanced at me as though seeking a steadier opinion. I spoke firmly, for Holmes's urgency had infected me. "Inspector, I can attest to all that Holmes has said. We trailed Varga ourselves," observed his servant, "and heard from the hotel staff. I am convinced beyond doubt that Miss Montague's safety depends on immediate action." At length Lestrade rose with a sigh. "Very well. You have a knack for dragging me into the most infernal scrapes, Holmes. I'll put a squad at your disposal. But mind, if this comes to nothing, the commissioner will have my hide and I'll see you share the roasting." "An equitable arrangement," Holmes replied dryly. "Have your men at Wapping by 10 o'clock. We must be in place before the villains begin their work." Thus the evening found us skulking along the shadowy alleys of the riverside. The smell of tar and brine thick in the air. The fog clung low over the water, muffling the creak of timbers and the lap of waves against stone. Gas lamps burned fitfully, their halos diffused to pale globes. Holmes led us unerringly to a vantage point overlooking the Zephyr. She was a sturdy vessel, her decks busy with sailors preparing for departure. Crates and barrels lined the wharf, and the distant clank of chains echoed in the mist. Lestrade's men melted into doorways and behind piles of cargo, their muffled orders betraying discipline if not enthusiasm. "Now we wait," Holmes whispered, crouching beside me behind a stack of timber. "Patience, Watson. Our quarry cannot resist the tide." The hours crept by, punctuated only by the splash of water and the calls of sailors. At last, shortly before 11, a carriage rattled into view. Its wheels hissed on the damp cobbles, and two cloaked figures alighted. Even in the gloom, I recognized Varga's tall silhouette and the slighter form of his servant. Between them they half-carried, half-dragged a veiled woman. My heart leapt. Clara Montague. She moved weakly, as though drugged, her head lolling upon her breast. Varga barked an order in a guttural accent, and two sailors hurried forward with a stretcher. The sight filled me with such rage that I nearly sprang from hiding, but Holmes gripped my arm with iron strength. "Not yet," he breathed. "Let them commit themselves. Evidence, Watson. Evidence first." The stretcher was borne toward the gangplank. Varga followed, glancing about with predatory wariness. At that instant Holmes gave a sharp whistle. Lestrade's men surged forward, lanterns flaring, truncheons raised. "Scotland Yard, you are under arrest." The wharf erupted in confusion. Sailors shouted. Fists flew, crates toppled into the river with splashes. Varga drew a pistol, firing wildly. The report echoed across the fog. I saw Holmes dart forward like a panther, striking Varga's arm aside so that the second shot went harmlessly into the air. "Watson! The girl!" Holmes shouted. I rushed to the stretcher where Clara lay, her eyes fluttering open in bewilderment. With trembling hands I checked her pulse, weak but steady. "You are safe, Miss Montague," I whispered, though whether she heard I cannot say. Meanwhile, the melee raged. Varga fought like a man possessed, striking down one constable with the butt of his pistol and grappling with another. Holmes engaged him with grim determination, his lean figure weaving with extraordinary agility. I saw him twist Varga's wrist in a cruel lock, sending the weapon clattering to the stones. Lestrade bellowed orders, his men closing in. At last Varga was borne down, snarling curses in some foreign tongue as iron cuffs closed upon his wrists. His servant, too, was captured, though not without struggle. The sailors, seeing their masters defeated, slunk back to the ship with mutters of discontent. The fog hung heavy over the scene, lanterns flickering upon pale faces and gleaming wet stones. Clara Montague, pale and trembling, clung to my arm as I led her toward the safety of Lestrade's carriage. Holmes joined us, his breath coming fast but his eyes alight with triumph. "It is over, Miss Montague," he said gently. "You need fear no further harm. Varga's schemes end here." She tried to speak, but only tears came, glistening in the lamplight. I pressed her hand reassuringly. Lestrade approached, wiping his brow. "Well, Holmes, you were right this time. I'll not hear the end of it at the yard, but at least we have the villains in irons. And I suppose the young lady will have her fortune intact." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Fortune can be restored, Inspector. Innocence once lost cannot. Tonight we preserved more than money." As the carriage bore Clara away, I looked back at the wharf, where Varga was dragged toward the waiting cells, his face twisted with impotent fury. The fog swirled around him like a shroud, swallowing his figure into the night. Holmes and I stood together in silence, the chill wind biting our cheeks. At length he spoke, his voice low. "You see, Watson, the river carries not only trade but vice. It is a highway for both commerce and crime. We have stemmed one current tonight, but there will be others. Still, I am content, for Miss Montague sleeps in her own bed tonight, and her tears are of relief, not despair." He turned up his collar against the fog, his keen profile etched against the lantern light, and together we walked into the mist, the echo of our footsteps merging with the ceaseless lapping of the Thames. The dawn after the tumult upon the wharf found Baker Street unusually hushed. Outside, the city shook off its slumber beneath a veil of pale mist, while within the crackle of the hearth alone broke the silence. Holmes, who had not sought rest, stood at the window with arms folded, his figure outlined by the gray light. The smoke from his pipe hung in coils, and his eyes, though weary, burned with a strange fire of reflection. I had slept but a little, slumped in my chair, the images of the night's struggle pressing themselves relentlessly upon my mind. Varga's pistol flashing, Clara's pale form upon the stretcher, the fog rolling over the wharf as though eager to conceal the wickedness it had hosted. Holmes turned suddenly. "Watson, it is not finished." I rubbed my eyes. "Not finished? Varga is in custody, Miss Montague safe, her fortune secure. What more remains?" Holmes shook his head, a sharp gesture. "Do you think a man of Varga's cunning operates alone? That the net he wove about Clara Montague was spun by his hands alone? No, my dear fellow. Behind him is a mind calmer, colder, perhaps more dangerous. Varga was but the hawk. We have yet to discover the falconer." The words unsettled me. "But what evidence have you of this hidden hand?" "Evidence, Watson, consider. The laudanum, the false papers, the arrangements with the shipping line, all too smooth for a man who thrives on brute daring. Varga is a man of violence, of appetite, but not of subtlety. His arrest was almost too easy. He carried out his part with skill, but the orchestration, that was another's work. And I will not rest until I have drawn that spider into the light." At that moment Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a tray. Behind her came Lady Eveline Montague, her cheeks pale from anxiety but her composure intact. Clara leaned on her cousin's arm, her frailty unmistakable, yet her eyes bright with gratitude. She looked a different being from the half-conscious figure I had borne from the wharf. Holmes bowed gravely. "Miss Montague, Lady Eveline, your presence honors this humble room." Clara, her voice tremulous, said, "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, words cannot repay what I owe you. I remember little, only fragments of the carriage, the sudden hand at my throat, the darkness. Then confusion and dreams. I feared I should never wake. And then last night a voice, your voice, Dr. Watson, assured me I was safe. I owe my life to you both." I muttered some awkward protest, but Holmes only inclined his head. "Your courage in enduring so harrowing an ordeal speaks more of you than our small assistance. Yet if you would truly assist us now, Miss Montague, there are matters only you can clarify." She nodded. "Whatever I can tell, I will." Holmes's questions came with swift precision. "At the soirée where you were last seen, did you encounter Anton Varga before your departure?" "Yes, he was introduced as a continental nobleman. His manners were polished, though I confess his gaze unsettled me. He pressed me into conversation about my inheritance, which I found distasteful. When I sought to withdraw, he insisted he might advise me on investments abroad. I excused myself as soon as I might. Did any other guest take notice of this exchange? Several, I imagine. My cousin remarked on it afterward. Why do you ask? Because Varga had been circling you in society for weeks. Yet he is too notorious for polite circles to admit easily. He had a sponsor, someone of standing in London who smoothed his path. That is the hand I seek, Lady Eveline frowned. You suspect one of our circle? Holmes's eyes narrowed. I suspect one who profits if Clara Montague disappears, or if her fortune is otherwise diverted. Who inherits should she fail to claim her title? Lady Eveline hesitated, then answered, Our cousin Sir Reginald Montague, a distant relation yet the only male heir of the line. Clara's fortune passes to him if she were lost. Holmes's pipe snapped against his teeth as he clenched it. Just so. Reginald Montague, idle, indebted, and ever in need of funds. I recall reading of his gaming debts in the clubs. A man ripe for corruption, easily tempted to collude with such a predator as Varga. Clara gave a soft cry. You cannot mean Reginald? He was kind to me as a child. Kindness in youth, Miss Montague, is no proof against greed and maturity. The man you knew as cousin may well be the man who sought your ruin. But we shall not rest content with suspicion. Proof is needed, and proof we shall have. The women departed soon after, Holmes urging them to secrecy. When the door closed, he flung himself into his chair and steepled his fingers. Watson, our course is clear. We must probe Reginald Montague's movements of the past fortnight, his associations, his finances. The Yard may believe the matter concluded, but we know better. Tonight we hunt the hand that guided Varga. That afternoon we visited Sir Reginald's residence in Mayfair, a lavish house ill-suited to the state of his purse. The butler, stiff and reluctant, admitted us only after Holmes produced a card and a fabrication about legal business. Reginald himself received us in a drawing room filled with smoke and empty bottles. He was a man of 35, handsome in a dissipated way, with eyes too shifty for comfort. Mr. Holmes, he said with forced joviality, and the good doctor, to what do I owe the honor? Have you news of my cousin Clara? We were all so distressed by her disappearance. Holmes's gaze was piercing. She is safe, Sir Reginald, thanks to timely intervention. I trust the news gladdens you. Reginald feigned relief, though his smile faltered at Holmes's tone. Most excellent. And the villain responsible? In custody. Yet we seek to uncover all his associates. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You entertained Mr. Varga at your clubs, did you not? Reginald's hand twitched. Why, yes, I may have encountered him. He was presented as a gentleman of fortune. One meets all manner of men in society, you know, indeed. And did you also recommend him to the Montague household? Was it not you who contrived his introduction to your cousin Clara? Reginald's face paled. Surely you do not insinuate— Holmes cut him short. I insinuate nothing, sir. I state that your debts amount to several £1,000s, that Varga paid your gaming markers at the Corinthian Club, and that in return you afforded him entree where otherwise he would never have set foot. Deny it if you can, Reginald stammered, then rallied with forced indignation. These are outrageous accusations. You have no proof. Holmes rose, his figure tall and commanding. Not yet, perhaps, but proof has a way of surfacing. I warn you, Sir Reginald. Any further step against your cousin and the Yard will know all. We left him trembling with rage and fear. As we hailed a cab, I asked in a low voice, Holmes, do you truly believe him guilty? Holmes's lips curled into that cold smile I had learned to dread. Watson, his very denial, condemned him. A man innocent of collusion would have welcomed inquiry, not shrunk from it. But to strike now would be folly. We must catch him not in suspicion, but in act. He will move again, for greed such as his cannot be still. We must be ready when he does. That night, Holmes sat long over his maps and papers, his eyes gleaming with an inner fire. I watched him in silence, knowing that some deeper scheme was unfolding in that restless brain. At last he spoke, his voice low. The case is not the tale of one predator, Watson, but of two. The wolf who strikes and the jackal who leads him to the fold. We have chained the wolf, but until the jackal is exposed, Clara Montague will never sleep in peace, and I, for one, cannot permit that shadow to linger. The coals in the grate glowed red as blood. The fog pressed heavily against the panes, and in the silence that followed I felt the chill of menace yet unresolved. The night after our encounter with Sir Reginald Montague weighed heavily upon me. Though Holmes's calm reasoning left little room for doubt, I found it difficult to reconcile the image of Clara's cousin, pale, nervous, yet outwardly polite with that of a man capable of conspiring in her destruction. Still, Holmes had that look in his eye, the look that meant he had smelt corruption beneath the perfume of civility, and I knew from experience to trust his instincts where mine faltered. Our sitting room at Baker Street was lit only by the fire, the city's fog pressing against the window like a sentient force. Holmes had spent hours bent over his scrapbooks, club records, and a scattering of papers, while I sat in uneasy silence, my mind replaying Clara's gratitude, Lady Eveline's pale features, and the haunted gaze of Reginald Montague. The clock struck 11 before Holmes finally set aside his pipe, rose, and began pacing with that measured energy which signaled his thoughts had crystallized into a plan. "Watson," he said, pausing mid-stride, "the time for conjecture is done. We must put Sir Reginald to the test. And how shall that be accomplished?" I asked, though already I sensed his answer would be some stratagem to force the man's hand. "Observe," Holmes replied, with the air of a professor about to instruct a reluctant pupil. "A man of Reginald's condition, indebted, desperate, morally compromised, does not resist temptation. He invited the wolf into the fold once. Deprived of his ally, he will either slink into obscurity or seek another scheme to repair his fortunes. If he chooses the latter, as I am certain he will, we must be there to catch him in the act." "But what scheme remains to him now that Varga is behind bars?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That is the very point, Watson. Reginald cannot know the full extent of Varga's capture. To the public, the villain is merely a nameless foreigner arrested at the wharf. Our cousin may believe he can distance himself from the scandal, provided he acts swiftly. I propose to supply him with just the opportunity he craves, a bait too tempting for him to resist." I leaned forward. "Bait?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Miss Montague's fortune, of course. A rumor, artfully placed, that she is to make a declaration of her estate and sign over temporary management to her guardian until her health is restored. If Reginald is indeed in collusion, he will seize upon the information, and then we shall have him." The audacity of the plan startled me. "But Clara, do you mean to place her at risk again?" "On the contrary. She need not stir from Lady Eveline's house. I shall arrange for the matter to appear in the morning papers, and the rest will unfold naturally. If Reginald moves, we shall follow. If he abstains, then I shall be the first to admit my error. But I assure you, Watson, he will not abstain." Holmes wasted no time. That very night he dispatched notes to certain editors with whom he had cultivated professional acquaintanceship, men discreet enough to print a notice without probing too deeply into its source. The announcement, phrased in the bland language of society news, stated that Miss Clara Montague, recently recovered from an indisposition, has resolved to place her affairs temporarily in the hands of her cousin, Sir Reginald Montague, until such time as she resumes her public engagements. Holmes, leaning back in his chair, tapped the page with satisfaction. "There, Watson. A morsel sweetened for our jackal. By tomorrow afternoon, if I am not mistaken, we shall see him sniffing about the trap." Sleep eluded me that night, for I could not rid myself of the fear that Clara's name might once more become the lure for villainy. By morning, however, the die was cast. Over breakfast, we unfolded the Times and found the notice precisely as Holmes had dictated. He read it with a grim smile, then tossed the paper aside. Now we wait. Our vigil was not long. By late afternoon, a note arrived. Written in a hand Holmes recognized at once as belonging to one of his informants along the river. It reported that Reginald Montague had been seen in the company of a certain foreign agent, a man known to act as a go-between for dubious financial dealings, and that they had adjourned to a tavern near the Strand. Holmes's eyes glittered. "The fish bites, Watson. Come, cloak, hat, and revolver. Tonight we follow him." The hours that followed were thick with suspense. We shadowed Sir Reginald from a distance as he left the tavern in the company of the agent, their conversation too low for us to catch. They moved swiftly through the narrow lanes, finally parting near a disreputable lodging house. Reginald slipped inside with furtive glances while his companion vanished into the fog. Holmes beckoned me close. "We dare not enter at once. But observe, this house is a nest of rogues, many of them known to me. If Reginald seeks allies here, his intentions are unmistakable. We shall watch and wait." We stationed ourselves in a shadowed doorway across the street. The night dragged on, the fog thickening until the lamps glowed like dim halos. Hours passed, broken only by the occasional stumble of a drunkard or the distant cry of a watchman. At last, near midnight, the door creaked open. Reginald emerged with two men of rough appearance, their faces muffled, their manner furtive. They carried between them a small chest bound in rope. Holmes touched my arm. "Come, Watson, quietly." We followed as they hurried down the lane, keeping to the shadows. At length they reached the wharf side, where a boat waited tethered to the piles. The men hoisted the chest aboard, and Reginald gave a quick glance about him. His features were strained, his movements betraying fear as much as eagerness. Holmes whispered, "Contraband, or stolen documents. Either way, the law has him, but let us learn the full tale before we pounce." We crept closer, the lapping of the water masking our steps. Reginald bent over the chest, fumbling with a key. A flash of lamplight revealed papers within, their seals intact. Holmes drew in his breath sharply. "The Montague trust deeds. By heaven, Watson, he has attempted to strip Clara of her fortune this very night." Before I could respond, Holmes stepped forward, his voice ringing out like a pistol shot. "Hold, Sir Reginald. You are discovered." The men started violently, one reaching for a knife. I raised my revolver. "Stand fast or you'll regret it." For a moment, chaos reigned. The roughs cursing, Reginald shrinking back, the chest half toppled. But Holmes advanced with such calm authority that resistance melted. The ruffians bolted into the fog, abandoning Reginald to his fate. He staggered, his face ashen, his lips trembling. Holmes closed the chest with deliberate care. "Sir Reginald Montague, you stand in the shadow of transportation, if not worse. Shall I summon Inspector Lestrade, or will you accompany us quietly?" Reginald collapsed onto the wharf, burying his face in his hands. "I had no choice," he muttered hoarsely. "The debts, the creditors, they pressed me." Varga promised relief. "When he was taken, I thought I might finish what he began." Holmes regarded him coldly. "And so you would have condemned your cousin to ruin? You who should have been her protector? Spare me your excuses, sir. Greed is the motive, cowardice the weapon. That is all." We escorted him to the yard before dawn, where Lestrade, summoned by Holmes's telegram, received him with no little satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, rubbing his hands, "another prize delivered to us by your methods. Between Varga and this fine gentleman, you've rid us of a most unpleasant scandal. The Montague girl will have cause to bless your name." Holmes only shrugged. "Bless Watson's revolver, rather. Mine was the easier task." As we rode back through the waking city, the first light stealing across the rooftops, I felt the weight of the night's labor give way to a sober relief. Clara Montague was safe at last, her fortune preserved, her enemies exposed. Yet Holmes remained pensive, gazing out at the misty streets as though he saw further shadows yet to be dispersed. At last he spoke, softly, but with that precision that cut deeper than any shout. "Watson, there is no ghost more dangerous than the one that wears the face of kinship. Clara Montague has learned that truth tonight. May she never forget it." The wheels rattled on, the city stirring into life, and in the hush of dawn I knew the case of the missing heiress had reached its turning point. Yet some instinct told me Holmes was not entirely satisfied, that in his restless mind one final thread remained to be followed. The following morning brought with it a pale, watery sun, the kind that struggles to pierce London's perpetual veil of fog. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, his plate untouched, his pipe at hand, his gaze fixed upon the dancing smoke as though it were some coded message waiting to be deciphered. Sir Reginald Montague's arrest had seemed, to my mind, the conclusion of the affair. Clara was safe, her fortune secured, the villains exposed. Yet Holmes sat brooding, silent, a man still chasing some elusive shade. "You are dissatisfied," I ventured, pouring the tea. Holmes stirred, looked up, and gave me a thin smile. "I am never dissatisfied, Watson, merely unfinished. The web is broken, yes, but the spider may still lurk in the rafters. Do you suppose Varga and Reginald acted in complete isolation?" I frowned. But surely they had each other. Varga needed the heiress, Reginald needed the fortune. "What more is there?" Holmes tapped ash into the tray. "Observe the nature of crime, my dear fellow. It grows not in solitude but in society. Varga was no petty schemer, but a man of influence among certain foreign interests. Reginald, for all his weakness, would hardly have had the courage to attempt the theft of trust deeds without assurance of a buyer. I asked myself who stood ready to profit from Clara Montague's ruin. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson entered bearing the post. Among the letters was a sealed envelope marked with the crest of the Montague estate. Holmes slid it open and handed it to me. It was from Lady Eveline, written in a tremulous hand. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I write in deepest gratitude for your labors on behalf of my cousin. Yet I cannot but convey my unease. Since Sir Reginald's arrest, strange occurrences have troubled the house. Twice has Clara thought she spied a figure upon the lawn at night, though none of the servants confessed to being abroad. Moreover, certain papers from her father's study appear disturbed, though the room remains locked. Might I entreat your presence once more to assure us that the shadows are but imagination?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as I finished. "Precisely, Watson. The spider stirs. Fetch your coat. We go at once to Montague Hall." The journey into the countryside was somber. Clara received us in the drawing room, her face pale but composed, though her hands trembled as they clasped her cousin's letter of thanks to Holmes. Lady Eveline hovered protectively, though the fatigue of long nights was plain upon her features. "Tell me of these disturbances," Holmes said, his voice calm, inviting. Clara explained haltingly. Twice she had seen a figure, once by the yew hedge, once near the orangery, always vanishing before pursuit. Servants had dismissed it as imagination, yet she was convinced of its reality. Furthermore, when she entered her late father's study to retrieve a keepsake, she found drawers opened, papers displaced, though the key had not left her possession. Holmes listened without interruption, then requested to examine the study at once. The chamber was somber, lined with shelves of law books and family records, the great oak desk dominating the center. Holmes moved swiftly, his gaze alighting on the faint smudge of mud near the window. The subtle displacement of a candlestick, the faintest scratch near the lock of a cabinet. He knelt, examined the mark, and rose with a grim expression. "Watson, our foe is not imagination. Someone has indeed been here, and with skill enough to leave scarcely a trace. But for the fortune of a clumsy boot upon the sill, I might have doubted even myself." Lady Eveline gasped. "Then we are not yet safe?" "On the contrary," Holmes said, "we are closer to the truth. Whoever searches these papers does not act on impulse but according to knowledge. They seek something specific, something left by Clara's father. Tell me, my dear, what documents were kept in this cabinet?" Clara hesitated. "Only the older trust papers, the genealogies of our line, and a bundle of correspondence with my father's solicitor in Vienna. But those are of no consequence." Holmes's eyes lit up. "On the contrary, they are of utmost consequence. Vienna, Watson. Does that not recall Varga's own haunts? I suspect the correspondence contained matter which our adversaries believe crucial." The remainder of the day Holmes spent in close scrutiny of the papers. I meanwhile kept watch upon the gardens, though I observed nothing save the restless shifting of branches in the wind. At dusk Holmes emerged from the study, his eyes gleaming. "I have found it, Watson. A letter from Sir Montague to his solicitor, alluding to an investment in certain continental enterprises. He hints at a sealed codicil lodged elsewhere, a document whose production could alter the succession of the estate. Now mark you, if such a codicil were unfavorable to Clara, or if its interpretation could be manipulated, then Varga and his friends might see therein a lever of immense power. Our intruder seeks that codicil. Where is it now?" I asked. Holmes held up the letter. "It lies hidden, though the place is not stated. But I warrant our adversary believes Clara knows more than she does. Hence these nightly visitations. That night Holmes proposed we keep vigil. We concealed ourselves within the study, the lamps extinguished, the moonlight filtering pale through the drapes. Hours dragged by, the silence broken only by the ticking of the great clock. Near midnight, a faint scrape reached my ears. The window shifted ever so slightly. A shadow glided in. Holmes's hand gripped my arm. We remained motionless as the figure crossed to the cabinet, producing a set of skeleton keys. The moonlight revealed not a foreign agent, but a face I recognized with a shock. It was one of Clara's own servants. The footman Hardy. His features were tense, his hands trembling, yet his movements bespoke practice. At the instant he withdrew a bundle of papers, Holmes struck a match. The sudden flare illumined the room. "Enough, Hardy. Place the documents upon the desk." The man froze, then turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror. "I meant no harm, sir. No harm?" Holmes's voice was cold. "You who consorted with Sir Reginald's associates at the lodging-house, who crept by night to rifle your mistress's study. Speak truth, or by heaven you will hang with the rest." The man collapsed into a chair, his voice broken. "It was Varga, sir. He promised money, said there was a paper hidden here that would change the inheritance. When he was taken, another came to me, a man with a scar across his cheek. He bade me find the codicil and deliver it at the docks. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A scar, you say? Watson, do you recall the fellow who fled from the wharf the night of Reginald's capture? I nodded grimly. The one who escaped into the fog. Just so. He remains at liberty, and it is he who now directs the game. Hardy, you are a pawn, but you will serve us better as bait. By dawn, Hardy had been delivered into Lestrade's custody, though Holmes insisted the matter be kept quiet. Our scarred friend must believe the footman still at large, still in his service. Only thus may we draw him into the open. As the sun rose, Clara entered the study, pale from a sleepless night. Holmes reassured her with grave courtesy. Take heart, Miss Montague. Your cousin's perfidy and your servant's betrayal are but branches of the same root. That root we shall lay bare before this case is done. I beg you to trust me a little longer. Her eyes filled with gratitude, though her lips trembled. I do trust you, Mr. Holmes, more than anyone in this world. Only promise me it will soon be over. Holmes inclined his head, but when she had gone, he turned to me with that look which told me the battle was not yet won. Watson, we stand on the edge of discovery. But mark me, our adversary is clever, ruthless, and still at large. The final act approaches, and we must be ready. The fire in his eyes, the set of his jaw left me with no doubt. Though we had dragged Reginald down, though we had unmasked the servant, the true hand behind Clara's peril was yet to be revealed. And in that moment I felt, with a certainty that chilled me, that the struggle was far from over, and that before the curtain fell, we should find ourselves face to face with the darkest shadow of them all.